Chapter 13 of A Day of Rest, Part 2. The wagon rocked as one of the men got out and picked up one of the bundles of wood. It was then that Jim gave a kick with his foot against the side of the wagon. At the same time, Bert called out, but it was no use. Jim shook the wagon a bit, and Bert sounded like just a squealing pig. And that was the explanation that Ed made to Mrs. Wilson when she wondered about the peculiar noise. He said that they were carrying a pig home to be fattened. Soon after that, the wagon started again, but stopped before long. A big hand slapped down on Bert's back, bringing a shower of dust from the dirty quilt. Then the hand descended on Jim's head, ramming it hard into the wagon bed. "Pig, if you know what's good for you, you'll be quiet." Both Bert and Jim were quiet. The attempt to attract attention had been useless. There was nothing they could do. All their hopes lay on a 5-year-old girl that had never been in the woods alone before. She could be lost down in that holler all night long, wandering around and around. No one would think to look for her in the woods because they wouldn't think of her being there. Bert was afraid for Susan, and he was beginning to be afraid for himself. Without warning, Bert was crying. Jim felt Bert's body shaking, but there was nothing he could do to help. Bert was afraid because he had seen Slim Barton before. It had been a morning late last fall when Bert's dad had decided to take some young bulls down to his Willow Creek pasture. It had been a cool morning, and there was frost on the ground on top of the mountain. The pasture back of the barn had already turned brown, but Bert's dad thought the pasture down on the creek would stay green for some time. It had taken an hour to put the retaining sides on the borrowed truck and then catch the bulls and load them up. But it was still cool when they got to Willow Creek and let the cattle out. While they were working with the young bulls, Jazz came along and stopped to help. He had carried a tow sack and said he was going across the creek to gather some hickory nuts at the foot of the mountain. Bert's dad thought it would be a good idea for Bert to go along with Jazz nut hunting, as the shaggy bark hickory nuts down there were much larger and had softer shells than the small hard-shelled nuts that grew on top of the mountain. After Bert rummaged in the truck and found a sack, the two boys cut across the pasture and waded the creek before heading up through the pine trees on the other side to get to the nut trees farther up the side of the mountain. They found several hickory nut trees which they shook until the nuts fell to the ground. They had their sacks heavy with nuts when they started back along Al's boundary fence. They passed several walnut trees with the big nuts lying on the ground. They started to pour some of the hickory nuts from their sacks so they could get a few of the walnuts, then decided it would be better to come back later for the large nuts. They continued along Al's fence until they came to the old logging road. They decided to walk down the road to Al's house and leave their sacks of nuts there before cutting across Doug's pasture to Jazz's home. They were tired and dragging the sacks along behind them when they first heard the yelping and whining of the dog. Bert looked at Jazz, but Jazz only shrugged his shoulders and said that Slim Barton was teasing his dog. Bert hadn't heard of Slim Barton before. Jazz said that Slim Barton was staying at Walter Barton's house. Walter Barton wasn't there, though. Walter Barton had gone off to Hazard to work in the mines because he had been laid off at Steele's. Did he sell his house to this Slim? No. Mrs. Barton and Rob are still there, and Walter Barton comes when he can. 3 months ago, these two men, Slim and Ed, showed up at the Barton house. Walter wasn't there, but they told Mrs. Barton they had seen Walter in Hazard, and Walter had suggested that the two men could stay at his house a while, since Mrs. Barton needed help on the farm. And they stayed. They stayed. They have been there ever since. Al's wife, Millie, says she would drive them off, kin or not. She said they are mean and just plain trashy generally. Millie is a cousin of Mrs. Barton's, and she knows what she's talking about. Why didn't Mr. Barton send them away when he came home? Millie says that when Walter is there, the two men are just as nice as pie. They help with the work in the garden, in the barn, and even in the house. Jas and Bert had been close enough by then to see a man standing in the road with a bullwhip, cracking it first on the tail and then on the head of a mangy hound. The dog was slinking along on the ground, groveling and whining, a pitiful, disgusting sight. As the two boys passed, the man turned and cracked the whip on the ground right in front of Jas. Jas never flinched, never missed a step. So Bert did his best to do the same when the bullwhip hit the dirt right by his bare feet. He knew that without Jas being along, he would never have been able to keep from running. Jas was not along now, but Jim was. Bert was awfully glad that he was not alone. He wondered if Jim would be scared if Slim cracked a bullwhip at him. Jim didn't know anything about Slim, but he was having a hard time trying to convince himself that he was not scared. It was the jolting, he told himself, and the dust and the smell of whiskey that was making him feel so bad, not being scared. The wagon lurched and jolted. The bruises on Jim's shoulders and hips were becoming more like boils. The dust that had risen from the dirt road and settled on the quilt had sifted through in a fine powder to cover the wagon bed. With each jolt, the dust rose. Jim closed his eyes to protect them and tried to move his head so that his nose was over a crack in the wagon bed. The movement shifted more dust down from the quilt. It was just too much. Jim sneezed. Our pig is beginning to make noises again. A big hand descended on Jim's back with a whack. Now, pig, if you know what's good for you, you'll lie still and stop that noise. Bert also had dust in his eyes and in his nose. He couldn't breathe. He tried to snort softly to clear his nose. The jerk of his head caused the gag to cut into his mouth. Bert's face screwed up and tears rolled out of the corners of his eyes, but he held the whimper back until the wagon slid down into the ruts of the road with a jolt that bounced him into the wood stacked along the side of the wagon. With the jolting of the wagon and the rattle of the wood slamming against the sides, the whimper sounded like the whine of a cat. It evidently wasn't heard by Slim because no big hand descended on Bert. Bert relaxed. He felt much better. The tears had washed the dirt from his eyes and his nose. If only he knew what Susan was doing. Would she go home? Jim had the same question in his mind. Would Susan go home? And that's the end of chapter 14.